Let's bring in our guests. We're joined with, come on. There we are. We're joined with the one and only Michael Maloof. Michael Maloof is a former senior security policy analyst in the Office of Secretary of Defense, author, and regular contributing analyst on RT and other media outlets. He has nearly 30 years of federal service experience in the Department of Defense. Michael, man, thank you for joining me. Welcome to the show. How are you doing this morning?
I'm great, and thank you, and congratulations on your show.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I've had it for a while. I've just resumed doing it.
It's first time for me, so it's new.
So no, man, I really thank you. And I thank you for joining me on the show.
Sure.
Question. So recently, it became clear that the United States, under the Biden administration, has decided to send U.S. military contractors into Ukraine. And I guess my question would be, why do it now? He has just lost the race. In fact, I'd go farther and say he just lost the argument on that issue, considering Donald Trump took the opposite point of view on it. What do you think his purpose is of sending these people in now at the end of an election into which the Democratic Party lost?
Well, it's desperation, and it's he has no policies. We can see he has no strategic vision for Ukraine. He never had it in the beginning. This was all trumped up, a hoax based upon a hoax, if you will, to even go into Ukraine. And Biden and Tory Newland were very much involved in the original coup back in 2014, all because of NATO expansion. So people don't know or understand the history. They just think that Putin woke up one morning and said, "Hey, I think I'll go and invade Ukraine." No, that's not the way it worked. There's a history, and people need to know it, or they're condemned to relive it. And unfortunately, we have relived it here, and we're seeing it time and time again. That strategy has failed, if there was one. There was never any explanation by this administration as to why we were even in there in the first place. And there is no evidence that Putin is planning to attack all of Europe, unlike Hitler back in 1939. So even though people like to try to equate the two, it's reality says otherwise.
But what do you think the objective is, though? I mean, it's like, are these troops, or are these, well, they're not troops, U.S. contractors? Are they
private contractors?
I mean, the Biden administration effectively saying he's sending them there to help repair vehicles, F-16s, and et cetera, et cetera. But I guess my thing is, well, you didn't send them prior, or at the very least, you didn't acknowledge that they were there prior, which means you had to know that this was going to be somewhat of a risk to those people who were going in there in the first place. And more to the point, why now? Like, meaning, are these people a tripwire? Is this indicative of some kind of scheme behind the scenes? I agree with you. They didn't seem to have a strategy on this, or at the very least, it was one built on hubris, not necessarily good sense. But are they trying to trap Trump into something by putting these people in now to basically use them as a tripwire?
Well, it could be to get him so committed that he cannot get out of it. And that may be the desperate effort by this administration, I believe, because they don't have a strategy. They don't have a plan. These are the neocons hard at work. They're desperate. The neocons are desperate because they now see that two neocons Trump has refused to accept into his own administration. So they're getting the message that neocons will not be welcome in the new Trump administration. So this is a desperation effort. This is going to be our most dangerous time between the election and Inauguration Day, because Biden will still be in charge, and anything can happen. And this is why I think we're on a very slippery slope here in terms of holding our breath, basically, to make sure he doesn't get us into World War III. Look, these are private military contractors. They're not there just to change the tires and stuff like that. They're there. They're special operators. You got khaki and all these others. These are being paid by the United States government. These private military contractors just don't go in out of patriotism. They're paid by somebody, and that's the United States government. So they are an extension. Now, this is what makes it even more dangerous. This puts U.S. personnel in harm's way, not U.S. troops, but U.S. citizens. And as a consequence, and we saw it with the French. The French learned very bitterly when a lot of their people came back in body bags. and it could easily happen again, because they will become targets inside Ukraine if they're engaged with Ukrainians directly.
Agreed. Agreed. Let me ask you this. I want to read this memo, and I've mentioned this to the audience once before. William Burns. William Burns is currently the CIA director, and he wrote this memo. Niet means niet. WikiLeaks released this, and I'm showing it to the audience because I always bring this up, but I don't know if I've ever shown it directly to the audience. It says Ukraine and Georgia's NATO aspirations not only touch a raw nerve in Russia, they engender serious concerns about the consequences for stability in the region. Not only does Russia perceive encirclement and efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences which would seriously affect Russia's security interests. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split involving violence or worse, a civil war. In that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether it intervenes, a decision Russia does not want to have to face. Now, Michael, they knew this. This memo was put back in 2008. And they still continued with the exact same policy. And I guess my question was always, okay, did they sleepwalk into this, believing that, okay, well, Russia's not going to respond? Or did they do this knowing full well that Russia was going to be confronted with the choice of either responding or, for that matter, allowing encirclement, neither of which were good options, hence the policy that they went with? From your point of view, which one was it? Did they know this going in, that Russia was going to respond, in which case they could push through all of this economic and, for that matter, military support to Ukraine, or did they sleepwalk into it?
The memo was written in 2008. The coup orchestrated by Biden and Tory Nuland was in 2014. They knew exactly what they were doing. The whole idea was to find a weak point where they could put another country at that time under NATO auspices against the border. They failed in Georgia. I know for a fact that the Georgians actually started the war in 2008 that led to the Russian invasion, because their snipers, who was trained, I know were trained back here by Blackwater at the time in 2008, actually picked off about 8 or 9 Russian peacekeepers. And that's what brought in the Russians as a result. And the whole idea has been this NATO expansion. And this actually is contrary to a Western Eastern understanding and about half a dozen agreements, written agreements, and also by the president of indivisibility, that you do not arm the West at the expense of the East. And that is precisely what they did. After the end of the Cold War, the Warsaw Pact went away, but NATO didn't. NATO expanded. In fact, at one point, you had Putin trying to join NATO, and he was tossed out and said no. They did have an advisory group there, and they were basically ignored. So he was looking westward. He wanted to turn the page, as it were, at the end of the Cold War, but the U.S. shunned him, and it's these die-hard neocons who want to contain China and Russia. They want to have an enemy at all costs, and in order to justify their hegemony around the world, that is including military buildup and strong and having constantly throwing the United States dictating to other countries what they will or will not do in terms of interpreting democracy. And this is getting us into a lot of trouble. We can no longer afford it, and consequently, we've now created two things that are very interesting. As a result of our own stupidity and policies, we've actually allowed Russia and China to come closer together, and that was not to happen. And number two, we've actually our policies and have actually allowed for the creation and now the buildup of BRICS. BRICS was just a little association over here on the side. But now we have actually helped them, because now 40 countries want to join. Well, I was in Kazan recently and observed everything that took place there. And let me tell you, because we have ignored the developing countries, they are now looking to BRICS. Now, that said, and they want to create a mechanism that takes them out from under the U.S. Economic dominance, the dominance of the dollar and the Western financial system, because virtually everybody's being sanctioned. So they want to get out from under that. This is a mechanism to do it, but it's going to take time. It'll take about 5 or 10 years to do it. However, the question is, well, to date, I would say the Biden administration has not had a response to it. And
right.
But secondly, I think there is a way Trump can do something without going after BRICS so much as to complement, because the developing countries indeed need better representation, not only in international fora, but also in existing international groups such as the UN, the World Trade Organization, and the World Bank. And it has not happened. It has not happened. So there's a challenge out there, and we're going to see under the Trump administration whether they're going to be up to it.
Well, that's a good question. What the Trump administration is going to do. Now, Trump has been signaling that he is going to end wars, not start wars. I always said Trump is a wild card. I would argue that Donald Trump is not a peace candidate, but he is willing to engage in deals in order to end conflicts in a way that I have not seen on the Democratic Party side, or for that matter, even on other Republicans. Now, I guess the question becomes, what does he do? Now, he's gotten rid of Nikki Haley. He's already said Haley and Pompeo are not going to be part of his administration. Thank God. But there are other swamp creatures that could be added to Donald Trump's administration. I'm curious from your point of view, you've been in Washington, you've been part of the secretary, like in the defense industry for God knows how long in the White House. From your point of view, does the president have enough power singularly? Let's say if that was his objective. Let's say he was legitimate, that I want to end wars, not start wars. Can he fight the blob, as it's called? Is the president powerful enough to reshape the ideological positioning of the U.S., let's say, foreign policy establishment on his own? Let's say he brings a team with him that wants to do it. Can he do it?
That's going to be a loaded question. I would say hopefully yes. And I'll tell you why. When in his first administration, he knew nothing. He brought in all these swamp creatures, as you call them. We call them the deep state. They basically used and abused him. He's had one term out. Now he's back in. He's learned a lot. Right. But also world events have changed a lot since the time he was in. And we have, during the Biden administration, he has emboldened the likes of Netanyahu. Iran has strengthened measurably. BRICS has risen up. So there are more challenges on the international scene today that Trump is going to have to cope with. It's not going to be an overnight thing. Let's just be realistic and subject all this to common sense. One thing I would say is that just this morning, you had the Washington Post talking about a conversation that Trump had with Putin. Well, the Kremlin has now come out and denied not only that they didn't talk about Ukraine, they didn't even have a conversation. Right. This is the deep state. This is the deep state trying to undermine Trump before he's even in office. This is a desperation, because the deep state knows, and when I say deep state in this case, I'm talking about the intelligence community. They know that Trump will want to clean house, and this is their way of trying to cast aspersions on him even before he takes office.
So that's what that phone call was about. Because I got to be honest, I didn't fully get
if there was one,
what was going on and the reason that they would lie about a phone call like that. Because truth of the matter is, the moment that that's reported, invariably somebody is going to go to Moscow and say, "Hey, did you get a phone call from Trump? And what was the readout for that phone call?" And I remember when I reported this yesterday, I pointed out that there was no readout from the Russian side on the phone call. Okay, lo and behold, Dmitry Peskov comes on and said this was complete fiction, that this phone call never happened. They even went to Ukraine, and Ukraine said that we never had a phone call with Donald Trump about this. Right. And I kept thinking to myself, okay, where did the Washington Post get this story? Now, the Washington Post, anonymous sources, the ubiquitous anonymous source, gave them the information. Your point of view is, well, this is the deep state, the intelligence community, trying to get a lead in on Trump. But for what reason? I mean, certainly they knew they were going to ask Russia about this. What was the point in making a phone call or even putting this out in the press that a phone call took place that never happened?
Two things. Number one, the intelligence community is known for undermining it's the administration for under which they work. If they don't like a policy, it's their policy. They are a government unto themselves. You got to understand that. If it goes contrary to their own point of view, they will do everything that they can to undermine even the president of the United States. And they demonstrated that during the first Trump administration. Now, this also means that they are trying to undermine him even before he comes in. And they know that he is going to be cleaning house. He has to clean house. And I'm not talking just about the CIA and the intelligence community, but also the FBI needs to clean house at the top echelons, from top to bottom. Even the counterintelligence people, they all need to be cleaned out, because their action is definitely aimed at undermining this administration. They are they are in lockstep with the neocons, and this is why I'm a little concerned about Stefanik becoming the UN, being appointed UN ambassador. I'm very concerned about it. First of all, she has no international experience, but number two, she's a neocon in every sense of the word. She's an ardent supporter of Israel, and it has never once criticized Israel for even bombing the Palestinians. And yet but I would also say a third thing. Trump needs to leave Congress alone. Take no appointments out of Congress because of the thin majority the Republicans have in both the House and Senate. This needs to be really, he needs to be very careful in this. He can go elsewhere and find people, because everybody in the Congress is somehow tainted by the neocons, basically.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the reality of it is, if Donald Trump, I always say people of policy, like the people who you put into a particular position, are going to represent the policies that you're putting forth. You can't put Pompeo in a position and then make the guy a dove. It's not going to necessarily work. And so who he puts in these spots on some level is going to give some kind of context to what Trump is going to do in office. At least that's my take on it. That's my point of view on it. Yeah, Stefanik is not necessarily a good choice. I'm glad, however, that Pompeo and Haley are not going to be in it. But as we pointed out, there are other people who can put in those positions that'll be just as bad. You were in Kazan. I'm curious on your take on that. I was blown away by the BRICS summit. And wildly enough, that was something that they fundamentally avoided even talking about here in the United States. There might have been an oblique reference, but you get more than half of the globe, like 60% of the globe being represented at this summit, with all of these countries either in BRICS or wanting to join BRICS going forward. Just from an American's point of view, what was your take on it?
My take is that the Western media has totally ignored them, even though there were some representatives from NBC there. You had I believe there was a New York Times reporter. You got to keep in mind that it was a summit. It was not a forum. Our access was very, there was no access to the principles involved. And you're talking about 40 leaders, as you point out, from around the world, and that constitute a majority. In fact, the GDP of all the BRICS countries right now is greater than that of the G7, which is phenomenal. And 29 as opposed to 36% in the world. So how do you ignore that? How does the United States ignore that in its policy formulations?
No.
And you even had Erdogan there. You had Maduro there. Now what they did, this was the 16th session. The presiding president for the year was Putin. Next year it'll be in Brazil. Last year it was in South Africa. It's a rotating presidency. Under Putin, he introduced the mechanisms by which they were going to be doing this. Number one, they took no new members this year, no new full-fledged members. However, they did create a new category called partners. They brought on 11 partners They have 11. They have 11 permanent members. They brought on about 13 partners. They only made Erdogan, the president of Turkey, a partner. And even though he was there, and you'll recall that even just as he landed, there was a terrorist attack within this country by the PKK. That to me was instigated by the CIA in order to send a message. And so I think to Erdogan of the stability in his own country. So again, the deep state is working behind the scenes. Now they're going to go ahead. Now there are challenges. Admittedly, there are challenges. They also introduced the mechanism for the ability to begin to trade in their own currencies. There will not be a BRICS currency per se, but there will also be what they call stable coin, and which will be run through the new development bank, which is based in China, and that will be used in the currency exchanges away from the dollar. Now, what's important are a few things from this that stem from this. Showed that Putin was not in isolation. When you had 40 representatives from 40 countries show up, and I'm talking at the highest levels. And secondly, they just didn't send their foreign ministers. Their foreign ministers accompanied their principals. Secondly, you had with BRICS a statement that this was not anti-Western, it was just non-Western.
Right.
And in fact, Putin went on. He even had Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, there. What's ironic is that following BRICS, Guterres was to fly to Ukraine, and Zelensky refused to let him in. So that just shows you how split we are here in this world. But at any rate, the reality is that they're saying this was a message to the UN to also to reform, to bring in as permanent members more representation on the Security Council, which is probably not going to happen because of the U.S. and U.K. vetoes. So you're still going to have that East-West split, but BRICS is not out to try and destroy the Western institutions, but to give an alternative to the developing countries. Now we're going to see how it works. Now I see Trump coming in and not taking this as a belligerent approach, but more as a competitive thing. And I'll tell you why. I think what he's going to do, he's going to look upon this in terms of how do I keep these developing countries to continue to look at the dollar as the world reserve currency, which it has been since Bretton Woods back in 1949, I believe it was. Right. So and Putin acknowledged that. The reality is that he's got to do something that, from the Western standpoint, doesn't alienate them away from the dollar, even though some of it's happening. The calculation, the estimation is that it'll drop in the next 5 to 10 years from about 58% reliance on the dollar to about 40%. Right. Well, that could change if he does the following. If he brings the dollar back under the gold standard to give these countries, and it says that if you continue using the dollar as the world currency, you will know that it is backed by tangibles, gold, silver, energy. Unlike now, it's not backed by anything. It's just the full faith and credit of the United States, whatever that is. And we're not even being able to afford the principal or on the interest on that. So on that debt. So these are challenges that he's going to have to do. How do you bring in the gold? There's gold out there that can be recalled back in, but these countries are not going to be dealing in a currency that's not backed by anything. That's why you see these countries now offering in BRICS. It's interesting the mix that there are. It's mostly those that have resources, oil and gas, gold. All these tangibles. That's very, very significant. And so they're going to be looking to that. And if Trump is able to offer a program, this could have, it may blunt a little bit of the impact on the dollar so that you don't have the concern that you're hearing now about de-dollarization. It will take years to do that, even if he does nothing. But if he does something, that could offer a competitive thing in terms of the dollar. But it's not going to. But I think what's the train has left the station now, that they're going to be working increasingly in their own currencies because of the sanctions that have been imposed over time. And it was ironically in this first term that under Trump, the sanctions were used the most. He sanctioned everybody. There wasn't anybody in Iran I didn't know who hadn't been sanctioned. I mean, and it got to be a joke that if you weren't sanctioned, you were a nobody. You know, it's one of those deals.
Well, I partially agree with you on this. Like, they have organized as a direct result of us using the dollar as a weapon and us using these sanctions to go after these other countries, not to mention stealing $300 billion from the Russian economy. There's that. Well, they're not going to say it's stealing, basically stealing. I call it stealing. But on top of that, you're absolutely right. Those countries have gotten together and said, we're sick of this notion of a hegemon. We want to do something different. The reserve currency of the dollar has gone from 70-something% to 50%. And like you said, they're trying to use their own currencies for this. I guess the question becomes, how does Trump, I don't know if Trump is going to get in and work with them. I agree with you that he's aware of it because he mentioned it in a way that the Democrats never even brought up. Trump pointed out, hey, they're trying to stop using the dollar. But what Trump said was that he wanted to use tariffs and sanctions on anybody that decided not to use the dollar. I think this is harebrained, and this is going to expedite the removal of the dollar as a reserve currency. But let's say that's just big talk. In real terms, you really think he's going to try to work with the BRICS nations against this idea of hegemony and having this kind of world working together in this kind of peaceful world? Do you really think he's going to be able to pull that off?
I think he will fail in this regard if he continues to use sanctions and tariffs as a sanctioning tool against these developing countries. Should they look to alternative currencies, instead he needs to do something that entices them to continue looking to the dollar. That's one of the things that flowed out of this meeting, was their concern about secondary sanctions. And with Trump on board now, that coming on board, that means that they're going to be very leery of trying to cross the United States. That's why you see Saudi Arabia, even though it was invited to be a member, still has not ratified that yet. So they're being very cautious. But other countries have less at stake, and they're just going to go ahead and do it. But it's not going to isolate Putin. I think Trump can work with Putin. He can work with Xi Jinping. He has demonstrated that. He has demonstrated he can work with Kim Jong-il. I wouldn't doubt that he could even work with the supreme leader in Iran. This is, I think that he doesn't want conflict. He's made it very clear that war is not the answer to our problems.
Right.
But competition is, and we need to be able to do things in such a way that we work with other countries, even in a competitive nature. And so he's going to have more at stake. He has more challenges now, and I think he can do it if he has the right people around him.
Michael, last question before I let you go. The war in Ukraine, that's been going on somewhat in the background ever since the conflict where Israel has gone on this genocidal killing spree in the various countries. At this point, it seems like Iran will hit Saudi Arabia. And it seems like Ukraine is effectively incapable of holding back the Russian military, even though in certain parts it's still holding its ground, meaning the military is still functional, even if it's been significantly damaged. Looking at both of these conflicts, we have taken a particular position in both of these conflicts. And I would argue that despite the fact that Israel can murder a lot of people, it still hasn't necessarily been able to accomplish its objectives. In one sense, they're still fighting Hamas in Gaza. They have not been able to make progress in southern Lebanon, even though they've been able to murder a lot of people in Lebanon. And Iran has shown that it has the ability to hit Israel in a way that Israel cannot defend itself. And yet, they're still going. Netanyahu is still going on this genocidal rampage. The economy of Israel has taken a hit. Many people, I think you had like over 1 million people effectively leave, finding that it's not safe to be there anymore. I don't know how Israel can keep going in this. It's only a nation of 8 million people. It doesn't necessarily have this massive military. From your point of view, what is the objective in this? Certainly, it's not going to beat Iran. Is it to drag the U.S. into a conflict before, I guess, Trump gets in the office? Like, What is, from your point of view, given all of the challenges, and again, I accept that Netanyahu can murder a lot of people, but they're clearly vulnerable at this point, either to Hezbollah missiles and, for this matter, Iranian missiles. And yet, no idea of peace. Netanyahu keeps going on. What do you think the ultimate objective is for Netanyahu? And this will be the last question.
I think he feels that he has a very limited time, even though there have been discussions, as he claims, between himself and Trump in very recent days, and they agreed in all aspects. We don't know that. We didn't hear that from Trump.
That's true.
And secondly, I'm beginning to question whether they even had phone calls, because Netanyahu and Trump have a history of antagonism toward each other. So I'm very leery of the reports I'm hearing from the Israeli side of what Trump intends to do. I'm not hearing anything out of Trump. And I'm not hearing, and Trump has basically repudiated all of these so-called spokesmen for himself on what he intends to do on Ukraine. He basically has said no. And so he's thinking of other things. The thing is that he's not prepared to move on that yet. And I think he's not going to, I think his orientation in his second term toward the Middle East will be more oriented toward trying to placate once and for all the Gulf Arab countries. And because he's done everything he could for Israel, but Israel has done something that was just outrageous and unforgivable, if you will, through the genocidal actions toward innocent Palestinian people and Lebanese, I might add. He's just carpet bombing up there. So I think he's got, I really question, and I think Netanyahu believes that he's got to act now during the Biden administration. That's why I said earlier, between now, the election and inauguration, it's going to be our most dangerous period.
Michael Maloof, man, thank you for this, Michael, man. You're invited on anytime you want. Michael Maloof is a former senior security policy analyst in the Office of Secretary of Defense, author, and a regular contributing analyst on RT and other media outlets. He has nearly 30 years of federal service in the U.S. Department of Defense. And happy Veterans Day, Michael. Happy Veterans Day on this front.
Thank you.
Thank you, man. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's take a quick break. Michael was fantastic. We got to get him back on. He was absolutely awesome. I'm going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back. We're going to have KJ know. We're going to have a conversation about China and how China is going to deal with the Trumpian factor now that Donald Trump has won. He's president-elect. Stay tuned. Share, like, subscribe. We'll be back in a moment.